Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I opened the email at exactly 7:48 on a Tuesday morning. My coffee was still too hot to drink, and my inbox was the usual mess of follow-ups, half-baked spreadsheets, and meeting invites I hadn't accepted but would probably show up to anyway. Then I saw it. Subject line in all caps like someone had leaned on the keyboard by mistake. Important employment status update. The email was 3 sentences long, no greeting, no explanation, no signature, just a bland corporate memo wrapped in the kind of HR ease that's meant to sound professional, but really just tells you how little you matter. Dear employee, thank you for your years of service. As part of an internal restructuring, your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors. That was it. 14 years boiled down to an email so generic it could have been sent to a potted plant. No call, no exit interview, no handshake, no damn human acknowledgement. I checked the sender. It wasn't even my boss. It was some HR alias I didn't recognize. People Ops US East. Like I'd just been delisted from a spreadsheet. At first I just sat there, blinking. I wasn't sure if it was a mistake, or if I was dreaming, or if maybe this was some new internal phishing test. You know, those fake emails they send to see if you'll click something stupid and compromise the org. But no, this was real. A few seconds later, my system access froze. Outlook blinked out, Teams logged me off, and my badge credentials went dead. I was still sitting at my desk, still wearing my company ID on a lanyard, and already I didn't exist. And you know what the sickest part is? I wasn't even surprised. Not really. Somewhere, buried under years of nodding politely and being a team player, I'd seen it coming. The project takeaways, the skipped one-on-ones, the slow drift from inner circle to expendable. It wasn't a gut punch. It was a slow leak I had ignored until the car swerved off the road. Carl, my manager, the guy who called me partner when things were good and old school when they weren't, had been pulling back for months. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd lost a step. Maybe I wasn't keeping up with the endless buzzword carousel, agile transformation, digital first, culture evolution. But looking back now, it was like watching a magician distract you with one hand while stealing your wallet with the other. About 2 months before the email, Carl started rerouting my responsibilities for visibility. That's what he called it, visibility. Giving junior staffers a chance to lead while I provided context. What that really meant was I'd be stuck in the background, explaining the hard stuff while someone half my age took credit in the Zoom call. It's a weird kind of humiliation, that slow erasure. You don't even realize it's happening at first. One day, you're the guy everyone turns to when the servers crash, and the next, you're not even invited to the weekly check-in. You tell yourself it's temporary. You've been loyal. You've stayed late. You've canceled vacations, worked holidays, even stepped in when Carl's kid got mono and he disappeared for 2 weeks. You think it has to count for something. It doesn't. About a week before the email, Carl accidentally left me off a critical deployment. Said it was a scheduling mishap, but I saw the meeting invite. He had added every junior team member and our new strategic consultant from Boston. Everyone but me. When I asked, he smiled and said, "Didn't think you needed to be in the weeds on this one." The kind of smile that tells you he's already planning your goodbye cake. That cake never came. What I got instead was a cold, templated email and a badge that wouldn't let me back into the building. I didn't rage, I didn't throw a chair, or send an all-company email titled, "You'll regret this." No grand gesture. I just sat there for a minute, heart doing that weird flutter thing it does when you realize you've been played. Then I closed the laptop, packed up my few personal items, my mug, a framed photo of my daughter from 3rd grade, a novelty stress ball shaped like a brain, and walked out. But before I left, I did one thing. I forwarded the email, not to Carl, not to HR, not to my coworkers who'd avoid eye contact at lunch for the next month. I sent it to someone who'd emailed me about 2 years ago, a name I hadn't thought about in months, someone who had once asked, very politely, if I'd ever seen anything unusual in our internal systems. billing irregularities, strange expense cycles, inflated invoice reports. At the time, I'd ignored it. I didn't want trouble. I wanted peace. But now, trouble sounded like a damn fine idea. I clicked forward, typed out one sentence. Thought you might be interested in this. Attached a few documents I had saved out of habit. No explanation, no sign-off. And then I walked away. What would you do if you gave everything to a job and they dropped you without a word? Would you let it go, or would you make damn sure they remembered your name? I didn't burn the building down. I just showed someone where they'd hidden the matches, and I hadn't even started yet. There's a strange kind of silence that follows betrayal. It's not loud or angry, not the kind you see in movies with shattered glass and yelling matches. It's slower, heavier, like the sound of your own blood rushing in your ears while the world just keeps moving without you. That was the sound that followed me as I walked out of that building for the last time. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to look at. 14 years of my life poured into that place like concrete into a foundation, and they erased it all with a 3-sentence email. Not even an email from a human being, just some faceless HR address that probably sent the same message to a dozen other poor bastards that morning. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the first time I stepped into that office. Back then, the company was still finding its legs. The furniture didn't match, the servers crashed at least once a week, and the entire IT team shared one bathroom with a busted lock. But there was something electric about it. We were building something. We believed in it, or at least we convinced ourselves we did. I was 39 when I joined, older than most of the hotshots coming in from Stanford and MIT, but I had real-world experience. I'd built systems from scratch, pulled all-nighters when hardware failed, and kept calm while the new kids panicked. They needed someone like me back then, someone who could hold the whole thing together while everyone else tried to figure out which end of the server rack was up. And I did it. I held the damn thing together for years. I stayed late. I showed up early. I worked holidays. I once drove back from a Thanksgiving dinner 2 states away because our East Coast data center went down and no one else knew how to reset the routing config. My daughter cried when I left that night. She was 7. I missed her play the next day. I told myself it was for the future, for the college fund, for the house we were trying to buy, for stability. But in reality, it was for a job that never gave a damn about me. I didn't know that then. I thought if I just kept showing up, kept being reliable, kept saying yes, even when it cost me, I'd be too valuable to lose. Turns out, no one's too valuable when the spreadsheet says otherwise. I remember this one week, about 6 years in, when the system migration we'd been planning for months went sideways. The vendor dropped the ball, our infrastructure couldn't handle the load, and everything came crashing down. Carl wasn't even in the building. He was at some leadership retreat in Colorado, sipping overpriced coffee and talking about vision alignment. I was the one who stayed up for 46 hours straight, manually restoring backup images and rerouting traffic through a patchwork solution I'd thrown together with duct tape and prayer. When Carl got back, he called a company-wide meeting and thanked everyone involved for their efforts. He didn't mention me, not once. I told myself it didn't matter, that the real ones knew, that the results spoke for themselves. Looking back now, I realize that was the beginning of the end. That was when Carl learned he didn't need to credit me to benefit from me. I was dependable, quiet, didn't complain. He could shine, and I'd keep the lights on behind him. And slowly, quietly, he started cutting me out of the narrative. It wasn't all at once. It started with little things. I'd get left off emails, accidentally. My name would be dropped from project reports. He'd refer to my work as team effort, even when I'd done 90% of it alone. And like a fool, I let it slide, because I believed I was part of something bigger. I believed loyalty still meant something. Then came the consultants, fresh-faced kids in slim suits and sneakers that cost more than my mortgage payment, walking around with iPads and talking about disruption like they invented it. Carl ate it up, started holding brainstorming sessions where we were encouraged to challenge legacy processes. That was code for figure out how to do what John does without John. I saw it, plain as day, but I told myself I was overreacting, that after 14 years no one would just toss me aside like a burnt-out bulb. But they did, and they didn't even have the decency to lie to my face. There's something particularly insulting about being fired by software. I gave my best years to that company. I sacrificed memories I'll never get back. And in return, I got an auto-generated message and a locked-out badge. Not even a phone call, not even a nod from Carl, who I'd once thought of as a friend. Maybe that's the part that stings the most, the idea that I mistook convenience for camaraderie, that I thought Carl had my back, when really, he was sharpening the knife. The day after the email, I found myself pacing my living room with a beer in hand at 10 in the morning. I couldn't sit still, couldn't watch TV, couldn't even bring myself to call anyone and tell them what had happened. I felt ashamed, like I'd failed somehow, even though I knew I hadn't. That's the mind trap they set for you. When a company gets rid of you, it's never about your value, it's about their margins. But they make you feel like it's personal, like your expiration date just showed up a little early. That's when I opened my old work laptop, not the one they deactivated, but the personal one I used to mirror my work files at home, just in case. Old habits die hard. I dug through the folders, opened up saved documents, Slack exports, email threads I'd archived out of paranoia. And the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't the only one. There were patterns, sudden exits, disappearing managers, roles restructured and handed off to new hires from Carl's pet talent pool. It was deliberate. It was organized. It was more than just bad management. It was a purge. And deep in that folder, under layers of junk and forgotten PDFs, I found something else. A name. An old email from someone I'd ignored 2 years earlier. Someone from a federal office with a quiet inquiry about our financial reporting practices. At the time, I wanted nothing to do with it. But now, everything looked different. They wanted answers back then. Now I was ready to give them a few. It was never just a layoff. It was the end of a long, slow con. And I had the receipts. Carl Whitmore was the kind of manager who mastered the fine art of smiling while slowly pushing you off a cliff. On the surface, he was all handshakes and backslaps, the guy who remembered your birthday and made dad jokes during Monday stand-ups. People liked him because he made things seem easy, because he knew how to talk like he was listening, and because he dressed just well enough to impress without looking like he was trying. But if you stayed long enough, if you worked with him for over a decade like I did, you started noticing the rot under the charm. You saw how he shifted blame without ever sounding accusatory, how he offered compliments laced with suggestions that your best work might now be a little outdated, and how he constantly praised team success while never quite mentioning the people who did the actual work. And over time, you realized that Carl didn't rise because he was brilliant. He rose because he knew how to step on people without leaving a bruise. I didn't hate Carl in the beginning. In fact, there was a time when I genuinely respected the guy. He was organized, decisive, and didn't waste time in meetings, which in corporate America makes you feel like you've found the last unicorn. He took over the IT division about 3 years into my time with the company, back when things were still small enough that job titles meant less than whether or not you could solve problems. He was fast on his feet and charming in client calls, and I thought, maybe this is someone worth following. He didn't micromanage, and for a while he let me do my thing without interference. But then the company started growing, and as we scaled, Carl started changing. Somewhere along the line, he went from in the trenches to above the fray. He stopped asking how projects were going and started asking why they weren't already done. He began measuring people not by what they contributed, but by how well they played the game, and by game, I mean making him look good in front of the board. The first real red flag came when Darren Lewis, one of the best sysadmins I've ever worked with, got laid off with zero warning. Darren had been with the company from the beginning. He was dependable, sharp, and loyal to a fault, but one day his name just vanished from the directory. No farewell, no explanation. When I asked around, Carl told me it was part of strategic reallocation, whatever the hell that meant. I thought it was weird but tried not to dwell on it. Corporate decisions are weird sometimes. Maybe Darren had pissed off the wrong person. Maybe he'd been looking elsewhere. I gave Carl the benefit of the doubt, and that was my mistake. Not long after that, the young blood started pouring in. Fresh grads, all eager, all hungry, all wide-eyed at their first taste of corporate freedom. And guess who they were reporting to? Not me, despite my experience and record. They were placed under mentorship pods, led by new mid-tier managers that Carl brought in from outside, most of them suspiciously underqualified, and all of them loyal to him. My projects started getting reassigned, sometimes without notice. Carl would claim it was to spread the load, or create redundancy, but in practice it meant the kids he favored were getting all the visibility, while I was left doing cleanup work no one saw or appreciated. Then there was Megan, 27, enthusiastic and painfully green. She joined as a project analyst, but within 6 months was driving key strategic initiatives that somehow all used frameworks I had either built or maintained. Carl paraded her around like she was some kind of genius, and to her credit, she worked hard, but it was clear she didn't have the depth. Half the time, she'd slack me questions about tools she was supposedly expert in. I helped her, of course. That's who I am. But I started saving screenshots. Not out of paranoia at first, but out of habit. I'd learned over the years that CYA, cover your ass, wasn't just a saying. It was survival. The final straw was a meeting, one I wasn't even invited to. I only found out about it because someone accidentally forwarded me the agenda. My name was mentioned in a bullet point under Legacy Systems Transition Plan. Curious, I dug deeper and discovered that Carl had been preparing a transition roadmap to offload my responsibilities to a junior team by the end of the quarter. He never said a word to me, never brought it up in our weekly check-ins. He was planning my replacement like it was just another box to tick on his to-do list. And the kicker? He was framing it as a necessary shift toward modernization to align with new company values. That was when I realized Carl hadn't just sold me out. He'd built an entire strategy around it. He was gutting the department of anyone over 45 and replacing them with cheaper, more malleable talent who wouldn't question his decisions. And if that sounds like age discrimination, it's because it was. It was subtle, insidious, and dressed up in corporate lingo, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. I pulled old org charts, reviewed exit announcements, even checked hiring dates. The turnover was surgical. Every veteran who pushed back too much or cost too much was being edged out, and Carl was the scalpel. That's when I remembered the email. 2 years earlier, I'd received a quiet message from a woman named Sandra Morales, a federal investigator working with the Securities and Exchange Commission. At the time, I thought it was spam. She'd asked if I'd ever seen anything unusual in our reporting systems. Invoice anomalies, unexplained account activity, irregular timing in financial closures. I ignored it back then. I didn't want to get involved. But now, with everything laid bare and nothing left to lose, I searched her name again. She was still active, still watching, probably still waiting for someone with the guts to speak up. Carl had always been careful, always left the dirty work to someone else, but he'd gotten sloppy. He forgot that in pushing me out, he left behind a man who remembered everything. A man with 14 years of documentation, emails, backups, voice messages, and system logs, many of which were no longer accessible to anyone else because Carl's restructuring conveniently locked the doors behind him. He thought I'd go quietly. He thought, wrong. It was time to answer Sandra's email. The moment I pulled up Sandra Morales' old email, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not fear, not even excitement, but something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. It wasn't just the thought of getting back at Carl or even the company itself. It was the realization that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I had nothing left to protect. No ladder to climb, no manager to impress, no title to defend. They had stripped all that away with a 3-line email, and in doing so, They'd left behind a man with nothing to lose and a long memory. I clicked reply, typed out a brief message, cool, emotionless, professional, and attached the termination email. Not sure if you're still looking into this company, but I figured you'd find this interesting. Let me know if we should talk. That was it. No long backstory, no threats, just an opening. A door I knew she'd been waiting years to step through. Within 20 minutes, she replied. Her response was just as restrained. Yes, I'm still interested. Can we schedule a call? And just like that, the silence that had followed my exit was broken, replaced by the low hum of something stirring beneath the surface, something sharp, deliberate, and very much alive. The call was set for the next morning, and by then I had already started assembling everything I had. I wasn't just going to vent, I was going to deliver. For 14 years, I had been meticulous, if not obsessive, about documenting processes, changes, anomalies, and internal communication. I never trusted Carl, not completely, so I made it a habit to keep local backups of project files, budget sheets, approval chains, and version histories. Some were boring, some were redundant. But tucked inside all that digital debris were the cracks. Discrepancies between vendor payments and service timelines, ghost invoices that didn't align with project scopes, and, most importantly, a series of manipulated access logs that looked very much like someone had been altering timestamps and user IDs in our financial reporting system. At the time, I'd flagged a few of these irregularities to Carl and was told it was just latency artifacts from batch processing, a phrase that sounded technical enough to dismiss further questions, but vague enough to mean absolutely nothing. I never bought it, and because I didn't, I had saved the flagged logs, along with Carl's dismissive responses and the audit trails he never knew I had access to. I spent the better part of the night organizing the data, cleaning up file names, and cross-referencing dates with team activity. It was tedious, thankless work, the kind I used to do for people who would later take credit for it. But this time, it wasn't for them. This time, it was for me. When I finally got on the call with Sandra, she was all business. Her voice was calm but sharp, the kind of tone that lets you know you're not speaking to someone easily impressed or casually curious. I gave her a rundown of my tenure, explained the circumstances of my layoff, and walked her through the patterns I'd observed over the past 2 years, especially after Carl's sudden pivot to external consultants and the accelerated replacement of senior staff with younger, cheaper hires. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The facts were strong enough on their own. When I sent her the files, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a simple, "You've given us a lot to work with. This might take some time, but I promise, we'll be in touch." After the call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't crack open a beer or pace around like some kind of secret agent. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, my self-imposed exile after my layoff-induced mood swings had started wearing on my wife, and just stared at the wall for a long while. I thought about the birthdays I'd missed, the soccer games I'd skipped, the late dinners where I answered Slack messages instead of listening to my daughter tell me about her day. I thought about the years I'd spent trading pieces of myself for praise that never came and loyalty that was never returned. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not just the anger or the betrayal, but the exhaustion. The deep, bone-level fatigue of being chewed up by a machine that didn't even know your name. Still, I didn't regret sending that email. If anything, I regretted waiting so long. Over the next few weeks, I kept quiet. I didn't tell anyone, not my wife, not my old colleagues, not even my brother, who would have encouraged me to go nuclear the minute I got the boot. I knew how this kind of thing worked. Sandra wouldn't move unless she was ready. Investigations like this weren't fast. They required precision, evidence, leverage. But I also knew something else. Once a machine like that starts turning, it's nearly impossible to stop. And I had just given it one hell of a push. Meanwhile, from the outside, everything at the company appeared normal. Press releases went out. Leadership posts on LinkedIn continued as if nothing had changed. Carl was tagged in a photo at some networking event, holding a wine glass and flashing that same easy grin he always wore when he was up to something. It made my stomach turn, not because I was jealous, but because I knew what was coming. And he didn't. I watched from the sidelines, silent but attentive, and slowly the first ripples began to spread. An anonymous tip was submitted to a financial blog known for exposing corporate malfeasance. A former colleague reached out to say that 2 internal auditors had suddenly resigned. Then someone forwarded me a screenshot from an employee message board, cryptic chatter about an unexpected data compliance review and access being restricted to several key systems. I didn't reply. I didn't share the news. I just kept watching. You spend enough time inside a machine like that, and you start to understand its rhythms. You know when something's off. And right now, things were very much off. Carl had built his empire on charm, delegation, and plausible deniability, but he had underestimated one thing. Documentation doesn't lie. Emails don't forget. Logs don't cover for you. And someone like me, quiet, consistent, invisible when it was convenient, is exactly the kind of person you never see coming until it's far too late. The email I'd received, the one that ended my job, wasn't even addressed to me by name. But the one I sent back? That one had all the right names and all the wrong secrets. The funny thing about revenge, if you want to call it that, is that it doesn't arrive with fireworks or a round of applause. There's no music swelling in the background, no righteous fist pump as your enemy crumbles. Instead, it happens slowly, awkwardly, and almost always out of view. One morning you're drinking coffee and reading the news like any other day, and somewhere in the 5th paragraph of a dry business column you see a familiar name, a sudden resignation, or a curious line about regulatory review. That's how it started. Quiet, surgical, just like Carl had done it to me. The first real sign came in the form of an article on a niche financial news site, the kind that only people deep in the weeds of corporate governance or professional cynics like myself ever bother to read. It mentioned a mid-sized tech company, no name yet, under preliminary investigation for irregularities in vendor payments and internal financial controls. It didn't take a genius to figure out who they were talking about. The language was vague enough to protect the publication, but the references to timelines, project scopes, and East Coast operational teams made it unmistakably clear. I read the article twice, then 3 more times, before closing the browser and sitting there in the quiet hum of my kitchen, wondering what part of the iceberg had just scraped the hull. Over the next few days, the signs multiplied. Carl's LinkedIn suddenly went dark. His usual stream of motivational nonsense and leadership quotes evaporated without explanation. Colleagues I hadn't heard from in months began messaging me with hesitant questions cloaked in small talk. "Hey, weird question. Did you hear anything about changes in the audit team?" One even asked if I had been contacted by anyone in legal, a word that never floats into casual conversation without carrying weight. I played dumb, of course. I wasn't about to tip my hand before the river card hit the table. And then it happened, buried in a Friday afternoon press release when most people were already checked out for the weekend. The company announced a leadership realignment aimed at enhancing transparency and governance structures. Carl's name was absent, gone, not even the courtesy of stepping down to spend more time with family. Just vanished, like a stain scrubbed from the wall. I stared at the statement, rereading the parts about new oversight committees and partnership with external compliance consultants, and I felt something I didn't expect, not joy, not even satisfaction, but a deep, complex stillness. You spend 14 years building something, giving more of yourself than you probably should, hoping your loyalty will be seen and rewarded, only to realize in the end that it was a game you never had a chance of winning. You expect to feel triumphant when you finally strike back, but what I felt instead was something much heavier, a kind of quiet mourning for the years I had traded away, for the friendships that had dissolved in fluorescent lit break rooms, for the time lost with my daughter that no investigation or headline could ever return to me. In the days that followed, I watched as the company's name started showing up in more and more places, subtle at first, then increasingly explicit. Shareholders were demanding answers. A class action whisper began circling among laid-off employees who had noticed similar patterns of exclusion and manipulation. Sandra kept me in the loop, only sparingly, just enough to let me know that my evidence hadn't just been helpful, it had been catalytic. It had opened doors, triggered subpoenas, raised red flags that could no longer be ignored or refiled under internal resolution. Still, I wasn't at the center of it anymore. I had done my part. The machine was eating itself now, and I had no interest in dancing on the rubble. What lingered most wasn't the takedown, but the strange, empty space it left behind. I had structured my life around that job, my routines, my worth, my sleep schedule, even my damn identity. Losing it should have been a collapse, but it felt more like waking up from a long, exhausting dream. I didn't know what came next. I hadn't made a 5-year plan or drafted a mission statement. I was still sitting in the guest room, the walls lined with boxes I hadn't unpacked since the day I walked out. My wife was trying gently to coax me back into the land of the living. My daughter had stopped asking if I was okay, and instead started showing me her drawings without waiting for my approval. Life, as it tends to, was moving forward whether I wanted it to or not. There were moments when I second-guessed it all, wondered if maybe I should have just let it go, started over somewhere else, buried the bitterness deep enough to forget. After all, no amount of justice could give me back the years I spent trying to matter to people who saw me as little more than a budget line. But then I would remember Carl's smirk, the way he patted my shoulder while steering me out of relevance, the way he stood in front of clients and talked about integrity with a straight face. And I'd remember the silence of that termination email, how it didn't even bother to name me, how it erased 14 years with the same level of attention as deleting a calendar invite. That was the real crime. That was what deserved an answer. In the end, I didn't need them to say my name in an apology. I didn't need them to grovel or offer a settlement or put up a plaque that read, "In honor of the guy who saved our asses for a decade." What I needed, what I got, was the knowledge that they could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. The story was out. The damage was done. And maybe, just maybe, the next Carl who thought he could cut corners on the backs of quiet veterans like me would think twice. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. If all the files, the emails, the late-night sorting, and years of quiet anger were really worth the final outcome. And I never give them a straight answer, because the truth is complicated. It wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to disappear, about not letting them pretend I was just another outdated cog replaced for efficiency's sake, about making damn sure they remembered I was there, because I was. I had been there through it all, and I made sure they'd never forget it.